Hello and welcome to the Police Interpreting Online Induction for Global Connects. On this slide we have an overview of the content of this induction, and you can read over the points there. We're going to talk about the legal framework for interpreting, the types of police jobs that come up, the rules and guidelines that are particular to police work. We're going to talk you through what happens when you go to the police station, and also what happens when you're involved in helping the police to take witness statements. We're also going to talk about what happens when you're working with defence solicitors, and that sometimes happens in the police context, especially the police station again. Then we'll talk about some other types of police work that might come up. We're going to talk about what you need to remember to do before you leave a job. And then we'll also discuss the implications of working for the police and how that affects court work. And at the end we'll have a brief summary of everything that we've talked about, and then I'll talk about the induction test that you have to do afterwards. I wanted to just begin by discussing the legal framework for interpreting for the police. Equal access to justice has been a part of British law for many centuries, and the current law is now enshrined in both UK statute, EU law, and the European Convention on Human Rights. In summary, the police must use interpreters to ensure equality in the provision of police services for all people, regardless of which languages they speak. In this section of the induction, we're going to discuss the types of police jobs that are likely to come up. So who will you be interpreting for in police appointments? The answer to that is you could interpret for anyone who the police need to communicate with, where they cannot do so because of a language barrier. This can include victims of crime, witnesses to crimes, people who are suspected of committing crime, and anyone else who might need police help or advice in the community. So what kinds of work might be involved? Well, there are a number of things to discuss here. The first one to talk about are police interviews under caution with suspects. Now, when an interview is described as being under caution, that means that the person being interviewed has been read their rights, which means their rights to speak to a lawyer, their rights not to say anything that might incriminate them, and it also advises them that what they do say will be recorded and can be used in evidence in a subsequent court case. Another type of meeting would be a confidential meeting between a suspect and his or her defence solicitor, which might also take place in the police station while someone is in custody. And I'll talk more about them later in a separate section. Often at the end of a police interview, you might have to explain to a suspect when they have been cautioned, which is when the interview changes from a straightforward interview to an interview under caution. And you probably will also have times where you have to explain that a person is now being charged with a crime and is being arrested. And also you'd have to explain to them what's going to happen next, whether that means they're going to be kept in custody until they go to court, or whether it might mean that they're going to be released on an undertaking that they will appear in court at a later date, or there may be other things that the police wish you to communicate on their behalf to the person who is in the police station. A slightly different type of police job would be where you are helping the police to take a written statement from victims or other witnesses to crimes who need an interpreter, and we'll talk about that separately later. And finally, there may also be jobs where you're helping the police speak to the public more generally about things like crime prevention, police initiatives in their area, and stuff like that. That might take place in the police station or outside on home visits or at public meetings. In this next section, I want to talk about some of the rules and guidelines that are important when working as an interpreter for the police. Some of these things will be the same as any other interpreting job, and some of them will be very particular to police work. The first thing to remember is that your role as an interpreter is only to facilitate or help communication between the two parties who do not share a common language. And in police work, one of the parties will usually be a police officer, and the other party, as we've already looked at, could be a person who's suspected of crime, a witness to crime, or a member of the general public that the police need to speak to. It is very important in police work that you remember that you are always independent and impartial. And that means that you are neither on the side of the police or of the suspect. It's easy sometimes to get drawn into situations where you might start to feel that you're there to help the police, or indeed that you're somehow there to help the suspect, but you're not there to do that. You're there only to help them communicate with each other, and you must never forget that. This next point is a very practical one. Do not allow yourself to be left alone with a witness or a suspect. If police officers leave a suspect alone in a room for any reason, you should make sure that you accompany them out of the room. If you are left alone with someone, then the trouble is that the police don't know what's being said outside their presence, and it can lead to problems later with questions on your independence and impartiality. So the best way to avoid that is not to put yourself in that position at all. This next point follows on from the idea of you being independent and impartial. Please remember that it is not part of your role to look after or to advocate for a suspect or a witness. Your role is merely to help communication, and that's a vital role, but please don't get drawn into arguing on the person's behalf or trying to be the person that's their friend in the room, because that leads to problems later, and it's much better to avoid that and stay professional, detached, calm, and concentrate on helping communication only. Also, do not meet with a witness or a suspect outside of the job, and never give out your personal contact details to anyone when you're doing a police job. Apart from anything else, it's inevitable that you will be working with people who are guilty of committing crimes sometimes, and it's not a good idea to let them know where you live or give them means to contact you, especially if they somehow blame you for their position. So just remember, even if they ask you, don't give out your contact details. You should never give your opinion on any matter except relating to language or cultural issues. And this applies even when you are asked by a police officer to give an opinion. You should only give an opinion when it's to do with what's being said, or possibly if there's a cultural issue that the police don't understand. But you shouldn't give any other type of opinion. In particular, you should not express any view about whether you think a suspect is telling the truth, nor should you verify anything. For example, that a person comes from where he claims to be from. That may be something that you will know as a native speaker of the language, but you should not offer up that information to the police. You should only interpret what's actually said. If at any time you're asked to give your opinion, you should politely but firmly refuse to do so, and if necessary tell the police officer that it would be inappropriate for you to express an opinion. And lastly, it goes without saying probably, but you must treat police work with the utmost confidentiality. To break confidentiality in a matter concerning criminal activity or a police investigation could lead to serious consequences for you, including criminal charges against you. So under no circumstances must you break confidentiality when conducting police work. This is our third slide on rules and guidelines for police work, and just contains a number of other important things to remember. This is a general point for interpreting, but it applies equally to police work, of course. Always remember to use direct speech, not reported speech. So if the person being interviewed said, "I was not there," you would say in the other language, "I was not there." You don't say, "He says he was not there." Be confident to interrupt if you need anything repeated or clarified, or if you need someone to speak slower, or for any other reason that's relevant to your interpreting task. If during an interpreting assignment you become aware that there's been a misunderstanding on some point, you should speak up about this. In a long interview, you should have the opportunity to take breaks, and if necessary, you should interrupt to ask for a break if you're starting to lose concentration because the interview's been going too long without having a break. Our final slide on rules and guidelines for police work is just touches on some aspects to do with translation or transcription. As far as translation goes, you might be asked to do a short, straightforward translation as part of an interpreting job. Any task you feel is beyond your competence, you should politely decline. You should not do any long or complex translations while you're at an interpreting job. If you're presented with any documents that are lengthy or are going to require a lot of time to translate, you should refer such inquiries to Global Connects and our translation team, and these should be handled separately from the police interpreting appointment. As far as transcriptions go, you should never carry out any transcription process of police recordings in which you also acted as the interpreter in the recording. If a transcription is done, it needs to be done by a separate, independent person. In this next section of the induction, we're going to discuss the practical aspects of what happens when you go to the police station. And we'll just go through these. There's several slides dealing with this, and we'll just work through them. It's all quite practical stuff. The first slide deals with what happens when you arrive at the police station. You should remember to take ID with you to police jobs, as you may be asked to verify that you are the interpreter who was booked. Now remember, you should always have your Global Connect's Interpreter ID badge with you, and you should have that on when you go to police jobs. But I would also take another form of ID with you, such as a driving license or some other kind of ID document. When you arrive at the police station, remember to note your time of arrival, as this will be important later when you're submitting your timesheets. When you arrive, you should introduce yourself to the police officers on duty. There's usually a desk at the front when you go in the police station, and let them know that you're there as an interpreter and that you've been booked to come, and give them any other information that you might have as to who you're there to interpret for, etc., or who you're there to meet with. Once you're at the station and before you start interpreting, you should be given some information by the police about what the situation is that you're going into, what the investigation's about. If the police look like they're not going to tell you anything, then please do ask to be given some briefing before you go in and start interpreting, as you'll probably find this useful. Once you meet the person that you're there to interpret for, you might be asked to verify that you do not know the non-English speaker personally. For example, that they're not a friend or relative and that you have no other relationship with them. Once you meet the non-English speaker at the police station, it's important that at the beginning you establish if there's a good language match. Sometimes it does happen that the police will tell the booking team what language they think the person needs, and occasionally they get that wrong, or there's a mistake made in the paperwork. And so right at the start, make sure that the person speaks the language that you speak and that you can communicate with each other. And once again, just to say, this is also your opportunity to double check you do not know the person. And if you do, you need to let the police know. Sometimes from a name, you might think you don't know the person, and then when you actually meet them face to face, you'll realise that you do know them, though you didn't know their name. So that could happen sometimes, but that would be a rare occurrence. Also, right at the start, explain to them that you are the interpreter and that you're independent, impartial, and will interpret everything that they say. There will be no private conversations between you, and you will tell the police anything they tell you. Here we're going to deal with what happens at police interviews in some more detail. First of all, ensure that you are seated in a position in the interview where you can comfortably hear both parties, and if necessary, adjust where you sit if there's a problem with the place that you're first seated. In some police interviews, you might find that the non-English speaker is hostile or even potentially dangerous. Now, if you realise this, make sure you do not sit in a position where you could be attacked or would be unable to escape. For example, being blocked in a seat against a wall where you can't get up and move away. Most police interviews are recorded. When asked to do so, clearly state your name and that you are there as an interpreter. The police may ask you to explain that you are impartial and independent, and that you do not work for the police, and your only function is to help communication. And if the police ask you to do that, please go ahead. That's good practice to do that at the start of every appointment with the police anyway. This is just to let you know that when you're there for a police interview, you might be asked to complete some police paperwork as part of the job. This could include a statement detailing your name, who you interpreted for, the language involved, the date and time, and so on. This will be so the police can later have a chain of evidence if the case goes to court, so that they know who you are. Of course, not all police work involves interviews with people who are suspected of crime. Another important aspect of it will be when the police are interviewing witnesses. And this next section, we're going to talk about what happens when witness statements are taken. It's very likely you'll be involved in jobs where the police need to take a witness statement. This may take place at a police station, or at a person's home, or at some other location, sometimes even at the scene of an accident or a crime scene. Remember, it is the police officer's role to take the statement. It is not your role to take the statement. What your role is to help facilitate the police officer to take the statement when the witness does not speak English. During the conversation that takes place between the police officers and the witness, they will make their own notes of what is said, and obviously their notes will be in English. The witness's statement will then be written down in the language the witness speaks, and they will sign this version, having read it. When preparing the statement, the police officer will normally dictate what needs written down in the statement based on the notes of the conversation, and it would be your role to write that down in the foreign language. Sometimes the witness will write it down themselves and create the statement themselves in their own language. If they work that way, then you would need to check the statement over. Though I would say this is rarely done, and the usual way would be for the police to suggest what the statement should contain in it based on their notes. You may be asked to act as a witness to the signing of the statement by the witness. You may be asked to take away a copy of the statement so that an English translation can be produced. Or you may be asked to prepare the translation on site, as it were, especially if the statement is short and simple. So just to summarize the process, a conversation takes place between the police and the witness, and the police make their own notes. The police will then use those notes to put together a witness statement. Now that statement will be written down in the foreign language so that it can be read over and signed by the witness. You might be then asked to witness that the document has been signed, and then afterwards an English translation of the statement is also produced, either at the time or later, and that is then delivered to the police. If you are the person who translates the witness statement into English, you may be asked to certify and sign the translation as accurate, and you may also have to write a statement of your own in English detailing what you did to assist in the taking of the original statement and in producing the English translation. In this next section, we're going to talk about what happens when you have to work with defence solicitors while at the police station. Sometimes you will be asked to assist a defence solicitor in speaking with his or her client privately, and I mean without the police officers being present. You should only do this with a police officer's consent. Remember that anything discussed in private with the solicitor should not be divulged to anyone else. And I mean especially, you cannot discuss with the police officers what was discussed in private between the solicitor and their client. Just to repeat that point, you must not discuss anything with the police that was discussed in an interview between the defence solicitor and the client. And also, you must not allow such information to affect your interpreting or demeanour afterwards. Sometimes the defence solicitor interview will take place between two parts of the police interview, and it's important that afterwards you don't allow what you learned in the private meeting to affect how you interpret once the police are present again. For example, if you hear the suspect confess to his solicitor, you must not allow this to affect how you interpret with the police afterwards. If you cannot remain impartial, you must withdraw from the job. And to remind you that failing to follow these rules could lead to a case collapsing in court later. There are a number of other types of police work that might come up, and very briefly I just wanted to talk about some of these. The first one is what I've called community policing, and this is where the police get involved in things like disputes between neighbours or complaints about unsocial behaviour, typical ones being things like playing loud music, causing disturbances in the local community, and things like that. So sometimes an interpreter will be needed either to speak to the person who is making the complaint or to speak to the person who's had the complaint made against them. And this is low-level policing designed to stop things getting too heated or too serious, and to sort things out in an informal way. The second kind of job might be crime prevention. Sometimes the police meet with the public to advise them on how to keep safe or on ways to prevent crime. And this can either be at public meetings or at home visits. And the third type of situation is what I've called police incidents, and this is where something happens outside the police station and there's a situation where an interpreter may be required. And this could be something as straightforward as a minor car accident, or potentially something as serious as a hostage situation, I suppose. So that's the three other types of police work apart from interviews and taking witness statements. Before you leave a police job, you should make sure that you've completed any paperwork the police require. You should note your finishing time, and you should make sure you get your timesheet signed by one of the police officers before you leave. There is a link between police work and court work, and I wanted to make you aware of some of the issues that arise because of this. Firstly, you are not allowed to interpret for the police and then, later, to interpret for an accused in court in the same case. Once you are a police interpreter in a case, you will become a prosecution witness in that case, and so you cannot also be a court interpreter in the same case. That's the reason for this. If you have interpreted for the police in a case, you may receive a witness citation to attend court in any case in which you interpreted for the police. If you receive a witness citation, you must obey it, which means you must attend the court on the day that you have been cited. If you do not attend, in the worst case scenario, you could face the judge issuing an arrest warrant for yourself. So please don't ignore any witness citation you receive. If you have to go to court as a witness, loss of earnings may be claimed back when obeying a citation. In this slide, we're just summarising the parts of a police job, and this is a kind of overview of the other things we've already talked about. So at the beginning, there's the briefing and preparation to do the job, where you'll find out some of the background perhaps. There's the part where you introduce yourself to the suspect or witness and explain your role. There's the main part of the job, which will be the interview or the taking of the statement. There's the conclusion of the interview, where you have to explain what's going to happen next, whether that is that the person is going to be cautioned or charged or something else. Where a job involves written statements, there's the task of producing versions in the foreign language and English in written form. And then afterwards there may well be a court appearance involved. And remember, the court appearance might be many months after the police interview. If you have any questions about police interpreting for anything that's not been covered in this presentation, please feel free to send me an email, and the email address is on screen there. Remember, this picture on screen is a picture of a polar bear, and the reason why you're being shown this picture will be clear in a second on the next slide. After you've watched this presentation, we will ask you to complete an induction test. You must complete an online quiz to show that you have understood this induction. The quiz must be completed within Moodle, where you logged in to watch this training video. You need to score at least 90% in the test to pass. Please don't worry, if you have paid attention and watched this presentation, the test will be easy. You will need to answer a question about the animal in the previous slide to show that you watched the entire presentation before you did the test. Thank you for listening and watching the presentation. All that remains is for me to wish you well in the future as you work as a police interpreter. Thanks once again. Goodbye.